Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're jumping straight into a truly fascinating, completely unprecedented look at one of history's most infamous figures. Our objective here is to dive directly into the massive digital footprint left behind in Abbottabad, Pakistan. By doing a deep dive into the raw data recovered back in 2011, we're going to separate the carefully crafted myth of Osama bin Laden from the stark and honestly sometimes downright bizarre reality of the man himself. Okay, let's dive into this, because the sheer shock of the digital cache the Navy SEALs uncovered is just hard to overstate. When they raided that compound, they didn't just find the architect of global terror. No, they found an absolute treasure trove of digital secrets. We are talking about the private files, home videos, and personal communications of a guy who spent a decade living as a literal phantom. The intelligence community didn't just get a body, they got a direct window into his mind. Just look at the massive scale of this digital haul. The CIA later cataloged roughly 470,000 individual items. I mean, we're talking about 5 computers, well over 100 flash drives, DVDs, cell phones, disks. It all totaled over 250 gigabytes of data. For a guy who supposedly lived totally off the grid in ascetic isolation, his digital footprint was absolutely massive. This data gave forensic psychologists, counterterrorism experts, and intelligence agencies exactly what they needed to perform a complete psychological autopsy. And what they found was a series of shocking juxtapositions. The files contained exactly what you'd expect, right? Horrific, violent al-Qaeda propaganda and chilling videos of atrocities. But right next to those files were the most mundane pop culture artifacts imaginable. There were American movies like the animated film Ice Age, Japanese anime, and even viral YouTube videos like Charlie Bit My Finger. And surprisingly, the cache also contained a significant amount of globally banned adult pornography. It's just a wildly jarring mix of extreme fanaticism and completely mundane digital hoarding. Now, you might be wondering about that last item. Experts analyzing this data suspect that the illicit adult material might not just have been for viewing. Intelligence researchers point out that al-Qaeda was known to use a highly sophisticated technique called steganography. Basically, this is the practice of concealing a secret code or message right within an ordinary, non-secret file. By using specialized software, a seemingly random adult image or video could actually contain heavily encrypted instructions for operatives. This allowed data to be moved around without raising immediate suspicion from authorities who are only looking for text documents. Section 1. Life in the Walled Prison. Let's move to and see how this builds, because the files paint a picture not of some glorious mastermind commanding from a mountaintop, but of a surprisingly isolated, disconnected, and deeply paranoid life behind an incredibly high wall. He essentially built his own prison. We can actually trace the rapid shrinking of his world over time. By 2005, he forbade internet and phone lines in the house, completely cutting himself off from real-time communication. And his paranoia just reached extreme levels. In 2010, when one of his wives went to a dentist in Iran for a simple filling, he became terrified that a tracking device the size of a grain of wheat had been implanted in her tooth. By 2011, even his 2 most loyal bodyguards, who were literally his only physical link to the outside world, were exhaustively begging to be relieved of their duties because the isolation was just unbearable. His distrust of modern communication was absolute. At one point, his chief of staff actually wrote to him pointing out how incredibly difficult it was to rely entirely on human couriers and suggested they start using encrypted email. Bin Laden firmly rejected the idea. He scoffed at the suggestion, essentially saying, "You want to use encryption against the very people who invented email?" He firmly believed that the Western creators of the technology could easily crack any digital code, so he relied solely on physical flash drives ferried around by couriers. Section 2. The Vain Mastermind. You know, one of the most fascinating psychological revelations from these hard drives is his profound vanity. There was a massive contrast between his public image and his private reality. The public image he broadcasted to the world was that of an ascetic, devout warrior who had given up immense wealth to live a simple, rugged life. But the private reality found on the hard drives, that was an image-obsessed man desperately trying to appear young and composed. Videos actually show him sitting inside his compound, applying dark dye to his graying beard. Instead of being out on the front lines, he was hiding safely behind high walls, highly focused on how history would perceive him. He was deeply obsessed with his own legacy and controlling the narrative. He had a satellite dish to watch television, but the files show he would fast forward through news programs just to exclusively watch and critique footage of himself.
If a female newscaster appeared on the screen, he would pull up the satellite's opaque channel finder menu just to block her face until she was gone. Furthermore, outtakes from his propaganda videos show him endlessly re-recording his speeches. He was meticulously trying to appear perfectly calm, soft-spoken, and in total control. It wasn't natural. It was a highly produced performance.
Section 3. Faith versus fanaticism. The hard drives introduced deeply troubling ways he warped religious texts to justify atrocities. When we examine the findings of researchers who studied these files, it's absolutely vital to understand the distinction between the faith practiced by over 1 billion people and the violent fanaticism he engineered. Researcher Dalia Mogahade provided a really powerful analogy after reviewing the documents. She said that looking at how he interpreted religious texts is like reading a recipe calling for a spoonful of sugar, and instead of adding a cup of sugar, you add a cup of cyanide. It wasn't just taking things to an extreme, it was an unauthorized, deadly inversion of the text. He totally lacked formal theological training, yet he manipulated religious messaging purely as a political tool to justify the mass murder of civilians. And this radicalization didn't just extend to his followers, it completely consumed his home. The reality of his family life in the compound was essentially an isolated incubator for extremism. His highly educated wives actively participated in his terror network, helping draft and edit his public propaganda speeches. Home videos show a pretty bleak existence for the children, who were never allowed outside the compound walls. You see grandkids in the dirt shooting birds with BB guns for target practice, and young children reciting violent jihadist poetry just to win the smiling approval of their grandfather.
Driving all of this was what we can only call the 9/11 delusion. The documents reveal a bizarre, completely disconnected political delusion. Bin Laden was actively trying to plot a repeat of a 9/11-style attack. Why? Because he genuinely believed that if he inflicted another massive casualty event, the American public would simply vote to force Western powers to abandon the Middle East entirely. He completely misunderstood global politics, failing to grasp that the original attack actually resulted in a massive, decades-long increase of Western military focus in the region.
Section 4. A legacy of dust. And this brilliantly illustrates what happens when we look past the digital files to the real-world results of his decades of terror, manipulation, and violence. We see the ultimate failure of his vision. Looking at the broader Muslim world, particularly during the massive uprisings of the Arab Spring, 99.9% of the population overwhelmingly rejected his violent ideology. The people in the streets weren't waving al-Qaeda flags or asking for his brand of violent fanaticism. No, they were demanding democracy, human rights, and political freedom. His attempts to hijack a religion for his political war were fundamentally rejected by the very people he claimed to represent. The final files contrast his aspiration with his reality. The aspiration he preached to thousands of young men was to die a glorious, heroic death on the battlefield as a martyr. But the reality of his final moments was starkly different. He died while hiding in a comfortable house behind thick walls, leaving behind a ruined family, children dead, wives imprisoned, and a legacy of destruction that brought absolutely no peace to anyone. So as we look at the millions of zeros and ones pulled from those hard drives, we are left to ask, was he really a geopolitical mastermind or simply a deeply vain prisoner of his own making? A man who hid behind screens, hair dye, and high walls while sending others to die. It's a question that challenges the myth and forces us to look squarely at the unvarnished reality of the data. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the narrative.